Number 1. The Losharik. Somewhere in the Russian Arctic sits a submarine that officially almost does not exist. Its designation is AS-31. Its nickname, Losharik, comes from a Soviet cartoon horse built out of stacked spheres, and that name is a clue to the boat itself. Inside its outer skin sits a chain of titanium spheres, because a sphere is the strongest shape against pressure. That design lets it dive where ordinary submarines cannot follow. A military attack boat is crushed somewhere around 500 to 700 meters. The Losharik is believed to cruise at 2,000 meters, and some estimates push it towards 6,000. That is not the deep end of the ocean by accident. That is the entire point of the machine. The boat answers to a secret directorate called GUGI, the main directorate of deep-sea research, which sits outside the normal Navy. It is carried to its dive sites underneath a converted mother submarine, docked against the larger hull like a remora. Its work is the quiet business of the seabed, tapping undersea cables, placing sensors, inspecting the infrastructure that no rescue team could ever reach. Then, on the 1st of July, 2019, in the Barents Sea, something went wrong in the one place you cannot run from. A fire started in the battery compartment. In a sealed hull, fire is not the first killer. The smoke is. Toxic fumes filled the boat and 14 men died. Here's the detail that told the world how important this vessel was. 7 of the dead were captains of the first rank. 2 were heroes of the Russian Federation. Ordinary submarines do not carry that much rank in one hull. The crew reportedly sealed a hatch to trap the fire behind them, choosing to die in order to save the vessel and whatever it carried. The Kremlin admitted there was a nuclear power source aboard, then insisted it was completely isolated. Everything else was locked away. The depth of the dive, the mission, the exact position. Russia classified all of it. Independent trackers pieced together fragments from satellite images and port movements. And the strongest theory is that the Losharik works among the transatlantic cables that carry the world's data. Compare the silence here to the secrecy that surrounded the Kursk 2 decades earlier, and you see a pattern. The state controls the story completely, so if this is the version Russia is willing to admit, ask yourself what it is not admitting. Because the next submarine on this list was destroyed by nothing secret at all. It was destroyed by depth itself in plain water close to home. Number 2. The Submarine O-9. She was old before she died. Commissioned in 1920, she was an O-class boat built for coastal defense and for training a generation of submariners. By 1941, with war closing in, the Navy pulled her back into service despite more than 2 decades of wear in her riveted steel. On the 20th of June, 1941, she went out to do the one thing that tests a submarine most honestly: a deep dive. Her designed test depth was around 200 feet. That was near the edge of what an aging hull could bear. She slipped beneath the surface off the Isles of Shoals near Portsmouth, New Hampshire, and she never came back up. Her escorts, the O-6 and the O-10, watched the water and waited. What surfaced instead was oil and debris. All 33 men aboard were gone. The wreck told the story. She settled at roughly 440 feet, more than twice her intended test depth. That is not a small overshoot. That is a total loss of depth control. The boat sliding down into pressure, her hull was never built to survive. When the steel finally gave way, it did not blow outward. It was driven inward, plating folded like paper by the weight of the sea. This is the signature of implosion, and you will see it again on this list. Rescue was never possible. The great hope of that era was the McCann Rescue Chamber, a diving bell that could be lowered to a stricken boat and mate with its hatch. 2 years earlier, in 1939, that very chamber had saved 33 men from the USS Squalus. But the Squalus lay within reach. The O-9 lay far below it, past the depth any rescue gear could touch. The men were beyond help from the moment the hull began to fall. Consider the timing. She had rejoined the fleet only weeks before, and the United States would enter the war only months later. Metal fatigue in a hull 21 years old is the leading suspect, a reminder that test depth is a statistical promise, not a guarantee, and that promise weakens with age. The shipyard that had recently overhauled her faced hard questions about her readiness. Decades later, NOAA surveyed the site with side-scan sonar and found her resting quietly, a war grave left undisturbed. Her story stays obscure because it was soon buried under the wartime losses that followed. The O-9 died fast and near home, the next boat died slowly, an ocean away, and she carried 2 tons of gold down with her. Number 3. The I-52. This one reads like a spy novel because it partly was one. The I-52 was a Type C-3 cargo submarine of the Imperial Japanese Navy, launched in 1943, and she was enormous. More than 100 meters long, over 2,500 tons on the surface, she was not built to fight. She was built to carry. And in the spring of 1944, she carried a fortune. She left the port of Kure in March, bound for occupied France on one of the secret Yanagi missions that shuttled strategic goods between Japan and Nazi Germany. In her hold sat tin, tungsten, molybdenum, opium, and quinine. And in 146 bars, roughly 2 tons of gold, meant to buy German radar and machinery. It was a desperate late war exchange between 2 allies running short of everything. She never made her rendezvous. What she did not know was that Allied codebreakers through the Ultra program had already read her mail. They knew her route. They knew where, in the middle of the Atlantic, she planned to meet a German U-boat to take on a radar set and a German technician. This was the hidden war beneath the war, in which a decoded message could turn a rendezvous point into an ambush, and the crew of the I-52 sailed toward that point believing they were invisible. On the night of the 23rd into the 24th of June, 1944, aircraft from the escort carrier USS Bogue found the spot and waited. An Avenger torpedo bomber dropped a ring of sonobuoys, one of the first uses of floating acoustic sensors, to listen for a submarine underwater. When the buoys heard her, the aircraft dropped a Mark 24 homing torpedo nicknamed Fido that steered itself toward the sound. The I-52 went down with all 94 aboard plus her passengers, and she kept falling until she reached roughly 5,240 meters. That is far deeper than the Titanic, which lies near 3,800 meters. There, she stayed for half a century. In 1995, the treasure hunter Paul Tidwell located her using Russian survey ships and side-scan sonar, and imagery confirmed the hull and the cargo scattered across the abyssal plain. But finding gold is not the same as lifting it. At more than 5 kilometers down, recovery is punishing, and expeditions using deep-sea robots brought up rubber and tin, while the gold largely stayed put. She is also a war grave, which complicates any salvage claim. The tactic that killed her, sensors plus a self-guiding torpedo, is the ancestor of modern anti-submarine warfare. The I-52 hid for 50 years. The next boat's mystery lasted 7, in the frozen dark of the Arctic. Number 4, the S-80. She began as a Project 613 boat, the type NATO called the Whiskey class, a workhorse diesel-electric submarine of the early Cold War. Then she was rebuilt under Project 644 to carry cruise missiles, which added weight and changed how she handled in the water. She served the Soviet Northern Fleet, and on the 27th of January, 1961, she went out into the Barents Sea in the teeth of a winter storm. She did not come back, and she sent no clear cry for help. All 68 men aboard died. The leading explanation points to a single component. Diesel submarines of that era ran submerged by using a snorkel, a mask that draws in air for the engines while the boat stays just beneath the surface. That snorkel has a float valve that is supposed to slam shut the instant water reaches it, sealing the boat. In freezing seas, ice and heavy swell could foul that valve. If it failed to close, the ocean would pour straight down the intake and into the hull. The Soviet Navy searched and found nothing. For 7 years, the S-80 simply did not exist on any chart of the seabed. That silence reflected 2 things at once: the genuine difficulty of hunting a small wreck across a vast, brutal Arctic sea, and the reflexive secrecy of the Soviet system. Then, in 1968, they found her. And in a genuinely rare feat for the time, they raised her from the bottom. The recovery gave the investigators their answer. The flooding sequence matched the failed valve theory, water entering fast through the snorkel while the crew had no time to react. The bodies of the men were recovered and buried, giving their families a closure that many later Soviet submarine losses never received. It was one of the earliest successful salvages of a sunken submarine the Soviet Navy ever managed, and it handed engineers hard data on exactly how a hull floods and falls. The S-80 is far less famous in the West than the burning AK-19 or the lost Kursk, which is exactly why she belongs here. She is a deep cut in every sense. Her loss exposed how deadly a snorkeling diesel boat could be in Arctic conditions, and she foreshadowed the string of Soviet disasters still to come. One frozen valve, and 68 men were gone. The S-80 flooded in silence. The next crew died in an even deeper silence without a single alarm that anyone lived to understand. Number 5. Chinese Submarine 361. This is the eeriest story on the list because when they found the boat, nothing looked wrong. The submarine was a Type 035, the Ming class, hull number 361, serving the Navy of the People's Republic of China. The Ming class traced its design back through the Soviet Romeo type, a concept rooted in the 1950s and 60s. In April of 2003, she was running exercises in the shallow waters of the Bohai and Yellow Sea, close to the Chinese coast. Fishing boats spotted her periscope drifting with no response from the crew. When she was boarded, all 70 men aboard were dead. There were no survivors, no injuries from an explosion, no flooding. The boat was intact, the crew were simply gone, many of them still at their stations. The explanation is quietly horrifying. While snorkeling, the diesel engine appears to have kept running without properly drawing outside air, or its exhaust vented back into the hull. Either way, the engine devoured the boat's oxygen and poisoned its atmosphere in minutes. Carbon monoxide and oxygen starvation kill faster than a human being can understand what is happening. There was no time to send a distress signal. The systems kept running while the crew fell where they stood. 70 dead made this one of the deadliest peacetime submarine disasters in history. That number is itself a clue. A Ming-class boat normally carried around 55 to 57 men, so the 70 suggests extra trainees or observers were aboard. What happened next was almost as unusual as the disaster. China publicly acknowledged the loss, and state media reported it, breaking sharply with the old habit of total silence. Senior naval commanders were dismissed, a sign that the official inquiry found negligence. The tragedy exposed the growing pains of a submarine fleet expanding fast. The Romeo-derived design lacked the automated cutoffs that would sense a failing atmosphere and stop the engine. The boat was later recovered, refurbished, and, controversially, returned to service. The disaster, now studied as the 361 incident, drove reforms in atmosphere monitoring and safety procedure across the fleet. And notice the location. The Bohai Sea is shallow. This crew did not die because they went too deep. They died because the air ran out. Depth was not the killer here. The next boat proves the same point from the opposite direction, dying in minutes in shallow water off the coast of Peru. Number 6. The Pacocha. Before she flew a Peruvian flag, she was the USS Atuli, an American Balao-class boat later modernized and transferred to Peru, where she was renamed Pacocha. On the 26th of August, 1988, she was doing the most ordinary thing imaginable. Coming home. She was running on the surface at dusk, heading back toward her base near Callao, when disaster came not from the deep but from another vessel. The Japanese-built fishing trawler Kiowa Maru struck her from behind, tearing a hole in her aft hull. A submarine on the surface sits very low in the water, almost invisible in fading light, and the trawler's crew reportedly never saw her. The sea rushed in. The Pacocha flooded and sank in about 43 meters of water within minutes, taking 8 men with her. But most of the roughly 50 aboard survived, and how they survived became a landmark in the study of submarine escape. Inside the sunken hull, trapped men had to fight rising water and rising pressure at the same time. Some made free ascents, escaping the boat and rising through more than 100 feet of seawater to reach the surface. Divers worked against nitrogen narcosis and the ever-present threat of decompression sickness to reach the trapped crew and pull them out. Every man who rose too fast risked the bends, the crippling illness that comes when dissolved gas bubbles out of the blood. The escape from the Pacocha is studied to this day in naval training, precisely because so many men got out. It taught her hard lessons about the escape trunk, about buddy ascents, and about the discipline required to leave a flooding submarine in the right order rather than in a panic. The hull was later salvaged, and the dead were recovered from inside. This is one of the most significant peacetime submarine losses in Latin American naval history, and yet outside Peru almost no one has heard of it. That is what makes it a genuine deep cut. It also makes a blunt point about the theme of this video. Forbidden depth does not require a trench. It can begin in 43 meters of coastal water the moment a hull is torn open and the ocean finds a way in. The Pacocha became dangerous in shallow water. The next boat is dangerous even now, decades after she was taken out of service, because of what still sits inside her. Number 7. The K-159. Not every submarine dies on a mission. Some die on the way to the scrapyard, and that is exactly what makes this one a lasting hazard. The K-159 was a Project 627A boat, a November class attack submarine, one of the first generation of Soviet nuclear-powered submarines built in the 1960s. She served through the Cold War, then was laid up at a base called Gremika, where she sat for years while her hull rusted and thinned in the salt water. In August of 2003, the decision was made to tow her to the Polyarny shipyard to be dismantled. Because a corroded hull does not float well on its own, she was buoyed up by pontoons strapped to her sides. On the 30th of August, a storm rolled across the Barents Sea and tore those pontoons loose. The old hull flooded and went down in roughly 200 to 250 meters of water near Kilden Island, at the entrance to the Kola Bay. 9 caretaker crew were aboard for the tow. Only one survived. Here's why this wreck still matters. The K-159 carried 2 nuclear reactors. They were shut down, but they were still loaded with spent nuclear fuel, and now that fuel sits on the seabed in a busy corner of the Arctic. The environmental group Bellona and others warned that as the hull continues to corrode, radioactive material could begin to leak into one of the world's great fishing grounds. The decision to tow a rotting hull on pontoons through storm season was condemned almost immediately. Studies have repeatedly modeled the risk of leakage, and the site is monitored for radiation. Recovery of the reactors has been proposed again and again, and delayed again and again, because lifting a fragile, contaminated hull from the seabed is enormously difficult and expensive. Russia's nuclear agency has studied using a purpose-built salvage vessel to raise her, but for years, she has simply waited. It is important to keep her separate from the combat losses that share her lettering. The K-8, the K-129, the K-219, and the K-278 all died in service. The K-159 died in disposal, which makes her a different and very modern kind of danger, the legacy hazard of an entire fleet of aging nuclear boats. Her threat is her cargo. The next boat's threat was its own experimental weapon, and it went off at the dock. Number 8. The HMS Sidon. Sometimes the sea has nothing to do with it. Sometimes a submarine is destroyed by the very weapon it carries, and the crew never even leave harbor. The Sidon was a British S-class boat commissioned in 1944 near the end of the Second World War. On the 16th of June, 1955, she lay moored alongside the depot ship HMS Maidstone in Portland Harbor, loaded with an experimental new torpedo. That torpedo was propelled by high-test peroxide, a concentrated form of hydrogen peroxide, and the weapons were codenamed Fancy. High-test peroxide packs a great deal of energy, which is why navies were tempted by it. But it is dangerously unstable. If it comes into contact with the wrong material, it decomposes violently, releasing oxygen and enormous heat in a runaway reaction. That is precisely what happened inside one of the Sidon's torpedo tubes. The reaction became an explosion. It tore open the submarine's forward compartments while she sat quietly at her moorings, and the sea poured in through the wound. 13 men were killed by the blast and the flooding that followed. One of them, Surgeon Lieutenant Charles Rhodes, died trying to reach and rescue trapped crew, and he was honored for it after his death. The Sidon sank at her own berth within minutes in the shallow water of a home naval base. The disaster effectively ended the Royal Navy's pursuit of high-test peroxide torpedoes. The chemistry was simply too volatile to handle safely in the tight, contaminated confines of a submarine. And this is where the story reaches forward in time, because that same unstable propellant is widely believed to have caused the loss of the Russian submarine Kursk in the year 2000. A leaking peroxide torpedo, a runaway reaction, a catastrophic explosion. The Sidon was the warning that went unheeded. The wreck was raised, the dead were recovered, and the boat was later sunk again on purpose to serve as a sonar target. The Board of Inquiry studied the volatile chemistry that had killed her crew. Portland, a Royal Navy base, remembers the 13 with memorials, and the Sidon stands as a cautionary tale about trusting experimental fuels in a sealed steel tube. Once again, notice she died in shallow harbor water, far from any trench. The next boat is stranger still. It is a single hull that became a mass grave twice, under two different names. Number 9. The Thetis. No submarine on this list has a fate quite like this one, because this boat killed her crew, was raised from the dead, given a new name, and then killed a second crew. She began as HMS Thetis, a British T-class submarine, and in June of 1939 she went out for her acceptance trials, the sea tests that prove a new boat is ready. On the 1st of June, she dived in Liverpool Bay for her first real submergence, with civilian workers and observers crowded aboard. To check whether a torpedo tube is flooded, a submariner opens a tiny test cock, a small drain that should either run dry or run wet. On the Thetis, that little hole had been blocked by a coat of paint. The test cock ran dry, the crew read it as safe, and they opened the rear door of a torpedo tube whose outer end was open to the sea. The ocean came in through the tube. The boat sank by the bow and settled on the bottom, and for a while her stern actually stood above the surface. Of the 103 people aboard, only 4 escaped, using the Davis submerged escape apparatus to rise to the surface. 99 died. Rescuers reached the protruding stern but could not cut through the hull in time, and one of the worst peacetime submarine disasters in British history unfolded in full view of would-be saviors. The inquiry that followed reshaped submarine escape training and redesigned escape hatches and test cocks so the same blocked hole could never doom another crew. Then came the strangest chapter. The boat was salvaged, refitted, and recommissioned under a new name, HMS Thunderbolt. Renaming a raised disaster boat let the Navy shed the cursed name, Thetis, and put a badly needed hull back to war. As Thunderbolt, she fought in the Mediterranean and sank enemy vessels. But in March of 1943, she was hunted down and depth-charged by the Italian corvette Sicila off Sicily. She went down with all 62 aboard. Added together, the same physical hull killed roughly 161 men across 2 separate sinkings, under 2 names. A tiny block test cock cascaded into a 99-man catastrophe, and then the rebuilt boat became a war grave all over again. Thunderbolt's wreck was later found off Sicily, confirming the second loss. The Thetis died on a calm trial dive. The next boat died in seconds in a mined strait, and a handful of men had to swim for their lives. Number 10. The USS Flier. Most boats on this list were lost with all or nearly all hands. The Flier is different because a few of her men lived to tell exactly what it feels like when a submarine is destroyed beneath you. She was a Gatto-class fleet submarine, commissioned in 1943 for the Pacific War. On the 13th of August, 1944, she was threading the Balabac Strait, the narrow passage between Borneo and Palawan, running on the surface at night. She struck a mine, almost certainly part of a Japanese defensive minefield sown across that strait. The explosion was catastrophic and immediate. The Flier sank in seconds. Of the 86 men aboard, only about 8 survived the blast and reached the water alive. What came next was an ordeal that reads like an adventure story, precisely because it was real. The survivors spent roughly 18 hours in the sea, with no boats and no rescue in sight, swimming for their lives toward distant land. They covered miles of open water and finally dragged themselves ashore on a small island deep inside Japanese-controlled territory. There, they had to evade capture, surviving on what they could find until Filipino guerrillas and coast watchers found them and guided them to safety. Eventually, another American submarine slipped in and carried them out. Their story became one of the great escape and evasion tales of the entire submarine war. It also gave historians something rare, a first-hand account of surviving a catastrophic sinking told by men who had felt the deck vanish under their feet. Among the survivors was the commanding officer, Commander John Crowley, and a captain living through the loss of his own boat was itself unusual. The men navigated to land without instruments, an act of sheer endurance. The Balabac Strait had a grim reputation, having claimed other Allied submarines to the same hidden menace of mines. In 2009, the wreck of the Flier was located in the strait, and the damage matched a mine detonation near the bow, confirming the story the survivors had told for decades. She is now a designated war grave in those confined waters. The Flier's men lived because they were on the surface and could reach the sea. The next boat imploded at 838 meters, and it took every one of her crew in our own century. Number 11. The Nanggala. This is the modern face of the oldest danger on the list. The danger of a hull pushed below the depth. It can survive. The KRI Nanggala 402 was a German-built Type 209 submarine delivered to the Indonesian Navy in 1981 and later given a major refit in South Korea, completed around 2012 to keep her running. On the 21st of April 2021, she took part in a torpedo firing exercise in the Bali Sea, north of the island of Bali. She asked permission to dive. Then she went quiet. When she failed to report as scheduled, the search began, and soon an oil slick appeared near her last known position, the first sign that something had gone badly wrong beneath the surface. What searchers eventually found was heartbreaking. The Nanggala had descended to roughly 838 meters, far below her safe operating limit of around 250 meters. At that depth, the sea does not give warnings. The pressure is enormous, and when a hull finally fails, it implodes in a fraction of a second, faster than any human reaction. The debris told the story. Searchers recovered a piece of a torpedo tube, a coolant bottle, and prayer rugs from inside the boat, fragments scattered by the collapse. All 53 crew were lost, making it the worst submarine disaster in Indonesia's history. A multinational search brought in help from Singapore, Australia, the United States, and others to locate the wreck on the seabed. The boat had reportedly gone down while a torpedo drill was underway, and the sudden appearance of the oil slick suggested the hull had ruptured somewhere in the descent. The boat's age, 40 years, immediately raised hard questions about the risks of operating legacy hulls, and investigators weighed possibilities ranging from a sudden loss of depth control during the dive to an internal failure that dragged her down. Whatever the trigger, the ending was written by physics. Once she passed her crush depth, there was no version of events that ended well. Indonesia honored the 53 with full military ceremony and declared the boat and her crew to be on eternal patrol. The disaster forced a review of the country's aging submarine fleet. It is one of the most recent and most widely reported deep implosion losses in the world, a blunt reminder that exceeding safe depth is instant and unforgiving, no matter how modern the Navy. The Nanggala is the present-day proof of an old law. The next two boats are legends, lost long ago, and both were trapped by shallow water rather than deep. Number 12. The USS Wahoo. Some submarines are famous for how they lived, which makes the way they died hit harder. The Wahoo was a Gatto-class fleet boat commissioned in 1942, and under her celebrated skipper, Dudley Morton, known as Mush, she became one of the most aggressive and successful submarines of the war. Morton pioneered daring tactics, including firing torpedoes down the throat of an attacking ship, meeting a charge head-on. Across 1943, the Wahoo sank a heavy tonnage of Japanese shipping and built a legend. Her final patrol took her into the Sea of Japan, which she entered through the La Perouse Strait, the narrow gap between the northern tip of Japan and the island of Sakhalin. She hunted successfully inside, sinking ship after ship, and then she turned to leave the same way she had come in. But the Japanese knew a submarine was loose in those waters, and they were waiting at the exit. On the 11th of October, 1943, aircraft and anti-submarine forces caught her in the confined shallow strait. In deep water, a submarine can dive away and vanish. In the La Perouse Strait, there was no depth to hide in, no room to escape. She was struck from the air and sunk with all 79 men aboard, some accounts say 80. In a single action, one of the war's most storied careers was ended. For decades, no one knew exactly where she lay, and the mystery of her precise fate lingered. Then, in 2006, a Russian-led dive team located her wreck in the strait, and the damage was consistent with the aerial attack that had been described. The United States Navy confirmed the identification, and families who had waited 63 years finally had a place and an answer. She was designated a war grave. The Wahoo's story carries a particular sting because she was so good at surviving. Her aggression and her record made her a symbol of the American submarine offensive, and it was not the open ocean's depth that killed her, but its absence. The the shallow trap of a narrow strait where a submarine cannot do the one thing that keeps it alive. She was killed by the enemy. The last boat on this list was killed by herself by the very torpedo she had just fired. Number 13. The USS Tang. There is no crueler irony in submarine history than this, and there is no more remarkable escape. The Tang was a Balao-class boat. Commissioned in 1943 and under Commander Richard O'Kane, she became one of the highest-scoring submarines the United States ever sent to war. She sank ship after ship, and she also served as a lifeguard, plucking downed airmen out of the sea during carrier strikes. She was, by any measure, an elite boat with an elite crew. On the night of the 24th into the 25th of October, 1944, she attacked a convoy in the waters of the Formosa Strait. She had fought her way through the escorts and lined up her very last torpedo. She fired it. And that torpedo malfunctioned. Instead of running straight, it ran in a circle, curving back through the dark water toward the boat that had launched it. It struck the Tang in her own stern. The explosion tore into her, and she sank fast in the shallow strait. Of the 87 men aboard, most were killed instantly or drowned as the boat went down. But 9 men lived, and how they lived is one of the extraordinary survival stories of the war. Some of them escaped from the sunken hull, using the Momsen lung, a simple breathing device to make a free ascent from around 180 feet. That is among the deepest documented successful submarine escapes of the entire conflict. Their reward for surviving was capture. The men were taken prisoner by the Japanese and endured harsh captivity until the war ended. Among them was O'Kane himself, who survived his imprisonment and later received the Medal of Honor for that final, devastating patrol. The weapon that killed her was a known hazard. The Mark 18 electric torpedoes of that era were prone to circular runs, a defect that turned a submarine's own weapon into a suicide device. It is a bitter footnote to a war in which American torpedoes were plagued by unreliability. The Tang ranked among the very top United States boats for tonnage sunk, and she was destroyed not by the enemy, not by the deep, but by her own last shot. She is the most famous name on this list, and she closes it. 13 boats, 13 ways to die. Now look at the pattern that runs through all of them. Lay the 13 side by side and a strange truth appears. There is no single way the ocean takes a submarine. There are dozens. Flooding through a failed snorkel valve took the S-80. A poisoned atmosphere took Chinese submarine 361. A collision took the Pacocha, a mine took the Flier, and a boat's own weapon took both the Sidon and the Tang. A loss of depth control and the implosion that follows took the O-9 and the Nanggala. Aircraft ended the Wahoo and the I-52. Fire took the Losharik, a botched disposal took the K-159, and a tiny painted-over test cock doomed the Thetis. Underneath all of it sits the physics of pressure. For every 10 meters you descend, the weight of the water above you adds roughly 1 more atmosphere. At the 838 meters where the Nanggala died, the hull faced around 84 atmospheres, well over 1,200 pounds on every square inch. When a hull finally fails at that depth, it does not tear slowly. It collapses in milliseconds, faster than a nerve can carry the signal to a brain. That is why these wrecks so often lie as debris fields rather than intact hulls. Notice how small the triggers are. A valve, a test cock, a single unstable torpedo, a battery. Depth does not invent new dangers so much as it magnifies every ordinary one into catastrophe. A blocked drain hole that would embarrass a plumber on land becomes a mass grave beneath the sea. And notice how often the human decision matters most. The choice to send an aging hull to test depth, the choice to tow a rotting reactor through a storm, the choice to trust a propellant that decomposes without warning. Across every era, one fact holds. Rescue depth has always lagged behind operating depth, so the deeper a navy learns to go, the further its crews drift beyond any hope of help. And the sea, patient and indifferent, keeps every one of them. Here's the last thing these 13 boats have in common. The ocean is in no hurry to give them back. The S-80 stayed lost for 7 years. The Wahoo lay unfound for 63. The I-52 hid in more than 5 kilometers of Atlantic darkness for half a century before a treasure hunter's sonar finally caught her outline. The deep hides its dead so well because it offers everything a hiding place needs: total darkness, crushing pressure, and a scale so vast that a 100-meter hull is a speck. A single submarine on the abyssal plain is smaller than a coin dropped on a football field, and the searchers have only sound to find it with. What finally reaches them is technology, side-scan sonar sweeping the seabed, and robots descending where no diver could ever go. Sometimes the search is driven by gold, as with the RI-52, and sometimes by nothing but the need to give families an answer, as with the Wahoo. When a wreck is found, it is usually declared a war grave and left undisturbed, the boat becoming a permanent tomb marked only on a chart. But some of these wrecks are not finished being dangerous. The reactors of the K-159 still sit corroding on the Arctic floor, and the clock on that hazard has never stopped ticking. Set against the boats lost with all hands are the rare crews who climbed back into the light, the men of the Pacocha, the Flier, and the Tang, whose escapes trace the whole fragile history of survival gear from the Davis apparatus to the Momsen lung. Their stories remind us what the others faced, and the newest losses, like the Losharik, remain wrapped in secrecy, proof that the deep is still a place where nations go to do things they will never explain. The ocean is the one archive that never fully opens. It keeps its hulls, it keeps its crews, and it keeps its secrets, in a dark so complete that some depths remain, by their very nature, forbidden.